So here's a tweet that was posted yesterday by a person identifying themselves as the skeptic. They show, it looks like a jaguar, maybe a cheetah. I don't know my big cats that well, tragically carrying a monkey in its mouth, and the baby of the mother still clinging to the presumably dead or soon to be dead mother. So this is an image clearly that's capturing the suffering of nature, red in tooth and claw. And it includes a meme comment. It says, I don't know if God exists, but it'd be better for his reputation if he didn't. The idea being that any God who would create a world with this kind of predation and animal suffering in it has something to answer for. Why would God create such a world with so much suffering? This is obviously an example of what is called the problem of evil more generally, specifically the problem of natural evil, presenting an objection to the existence of God or an indictment of the moral character of God, should God in fact exist. You can also rephrase it. If you've got a problem with the concept of natural evil, as some people do, you can rephrase it to be not the problem of natural evil per se, but rather the problem of suffering. Maybe you don't think there is some such thing as natural evil, and you think rather that all evil must be born of moral agency and thus be moral in nature. You can set that whole debate aside and just say, okay, we're dealing with the problem here of animal suffering or of the suffering of sentient creatures. That is a problem. Why would a morally perfect, perfectly loving, and good God create a world in which cheetahs or jaguars need to kill other animals to survive, including leading to this kind of agonizing suffering? The tweet was reposted by a fellow named Darwin to Jesus, who is just simply one of the most ignorant and acerbic Christian fundamentalists on Twitter. Uh, and somebody who I think boasts of having been an atheist for years and had a dramatic conversion to Christianity. And often what you see in situations like that is people assume that because they were, excuse me, because they were X and now they are not no longer X, then that gives them a unique privileged insight into X. There's some truth to that. Like if somebody says, "Oh, I think it would be wonderful to live in New York City," and another person says, "Yeah, well, I lived in New York City. It's not as wonderful as you think. There's all these issues with traffic and crime or high rent, etc." So to that extent, there's legitimacy to think that a former an ex-convert or a deconvert from some particular worldview or religious position or philosophical position may have some kind of insight into it. But you really have to keep in mind that just because a person is a Christian or an atheist or anything else doesn't mean they had a sophisticated or particularly nuanced understanding of the position they held when they in fact held it. I can't count how many Protestants I've met who were deconverted from Catholicism and now are the most militantly opposed to Catholicism. And they will say, look, I was a Catholic for years. Yeah, except your understanding of Catholicism is very warped and limited and ignorant. And so you are not a reliable guide to what Catholics believe. And I've seen this in the flip as well. I've seen um, Protestants who rejected Protestantism and deconverted move to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. Very often, they are not the most reliable guides either as to what Protestants believe. And just because Darwin to Jesus was once an atheist or a skeptic of some sort certainly doesn't give them any particular insights as it stands. And I think you just have to look at this person's tweets consistently. They're just terrible. So clearly, this was a deeply ignorant person. And I suspect what happened here is what I often see is when a person is a fundamentalist in one belief system, then when they leave that belief system, deconvert and convert to another belief system, like moving from naturalistic atheism or secular humanism to Christianity, they take those fundamentalist categories with them. Same thing goes in reverse. One example I've given in the past many times is John Loftus, who I co-wrote a book with him. I've done several debates with him. He's a well-known atheist, former Christian preacher. Well, if you look at his history, when he was a Christian preacher, he was a fundamentalist Nazarene preacher. He deconverted from that 20 years ago and became a fundamentalist atheist troll. And that's often what you see is people maintain their categories of fundamentalism when they deconvert and reconvert to something else or convert to something else. Okay, all that is to say, Darwin to Jesus retweets skeptic and says God's reputation is perfectly fine. If you see evil in the world, that's our fault. Take some responsibility. This is confused on multiple levels. First of all, the skeptic never references evil as such. But they are clearly alluding to suffering in nature, as I pointed out. Additionally, they could be referring to natural evil, which, by definition, if you accept the concept of natural evil, it is not born of moral agency directly. It's not the actions of human agents who brought about this moral problem. What Darwin and Jesus seems to be saying here by rebuttal is attributing the actions of this big cat, the predatory actions of this big cat in killing this monkey mother, to human moral actions. Because Darwin to Jesus says, what you're seeing here is, quote, our fault. Take some responsibility. So we, according to Darwin to Jesus, have some responsibility for the fact that big cats are predatory, carnivorous creatures that kill other animals to survive. We are responsible for that, according to Darwin to Jesus. Well, this prompted me now to tweet. And so here you get nesting dolls on Twitter, essentially, right? There's one encompassing another, encompassing another. And so I said Christian fundamentalists, like Darwin to Jesus, blame human beings for the existence of predation in nature. And I observed then not enough attention is given to how bizarre that claim is. This is something that I hear time and again that human beings, ultimately, tracing back to the sins of Adam and Eve in the garden, that is responsible for the suffering in nature, including the fact that animals are killed and eaten by other animals. So human beings are to blame for predation, carnivory, parasitism, death, mass extinction in nature. And I just point out that is rather a really bizarre claim, particularly given our understanding of Earth history. Now, a planet that is 4.6 billion years old, uh, life having existed for hundreds of millions of years on the planet before the appearance of human beings, including death, mass extinction, predation, carnivory, parasitism, all those things existing before human beings appeared on the scene. So I got a lot of responses to this from people who clearly didn't understand the issue. So this person, Luke, says blaming God for the existence of predation in quote unquote nature. Not sure why they use scare quotes there for nature. Anyway, they say that's far more bizarre. So they're saying it's bizarre to say God has any culpability or that the existence of suffering and death in nature, it's bizarre to think that would present any problem for positing a morally perfect, all-powerful deity who created nature. That's just not grappling with the problem. Here's another one. Silvani says humans brought sin into the world. Sin is death. Death can be caused by predation. Therefore, humans brought predation into the world. So they're just sort of doubling down or restating the claim that it is human beings that made jaguars and cheetahs and other big cats become carnivores and predators, which again doesn't address the issue that that is a bizarre claim when you look at science. That's the facts, Jack says. All I see is an animal with food in its mouth, just as nature intended. If you clutch your pearls at every snapshot of nature in its rawest form, maybe you should just remain in your basement for the duration. So I don't know. I guess this person is not particularly moved by animal suffering. If that really is their response, I think that they maybe have some serious issues with their moral perceptual faculties. If they are not at all troubled by animal suffering, by a monkey being killed and the baby clinging to the mother and soon to face its own imminent demise in the jowls of a big cat, predatory cat, if that doesn't bother them or move them at all, I think there's something seriously wrong with that person. I'm not going to opine as to what that might be, but I'm going to say the issue is with you. In the same way that a person, let's say, and let's say everybody in the neighborhood starts going, "Oh, what's that loud noise?" And one person says, "I don't hear anything." That person that doesn't hear anything shouldn't conclude there's nothing to be heard. Rather, the more reasonable response would be, "Oh, there is a loud noise, but my hearing is maybe damaged, and that's why I'm unable to hear it." And if that's the fact, Jack doesn't give a rip about the fact that animals suffer terribly in nature, but normal human beings do, then the reasonable person would infer there's a problem with my moral perceptual faculties. It's not that there's nothing here to be concerned about. It's interesting, just as an aside, to illustrate the fact that human beings are moved by animal suffering. There was a horror movie that came out in October of this year called Good Boy. And the movie is unique as a horror movie because it's told from the perspective of a dog who is as charming and resourceful as Lassie or the Littlest Hobo for Canadian fans or fans of Canadian television. Uh, the interesting thing was the big question on Reddit before when people were contemplating going to the movie Good Boy is what happens to the dog? Because people didn't want to go to the movie if the dog was going to end up being killed. What that just shows is one example of how normal human beings are moved by and concerned by the suffering of sentient animals. Dogs, especially because of the unique bond that many human beings have with dogs. And so the fact that that's the fact, Jack is not moved at all and does not care that animals suffer, again, is an indictment of their moral perceptual faculties, not a reason to think there is nothing to be concerned about. Darwin to Jesus also responded um, and did responded to me in a very acerbic and ignorant way. And honestly, I just blocked them because I thought there's no further point to engagement with this person. They don't even understand. They were very contemptuous and yet did not understand what the issues even were. So, what I wanted to talk about as I wrap this up is refer back to my 2020 book. I think it's 2020, Conversations with My Inner Atheist. This is a book, by the way, I just got hit by a wave of dust allergy, I think. I'm not becoming emotional when I talk about my book. That's not the issue. But in the book, it features a dialogue between me and a character named Mia. And Mia stands for My Inner Atheist. And each chapter is a dialogue, like a Platonic or Socratic dialogue between Mia and myself, or me and my own internal voice of criticism, questioning, and doubt about various theological issues. I think there's like 25 chapters. Chapter 8 asks the question, how did Adam and Eve turn T-Rex into a predator? So if you want to take this view that human freely willed action in the garden somehow had an impact to create to create a T-Rex who was once herbivorous and peaceful into becoming a fearsome carnivorous predator, how did that actually work? Here's how Mia sets up the problem. So this is an excerpt. Mia says, "Hey, here's a concrete example for you to chew on. Paleontologists have discovered fossilized dung from Tyrannosaurus rex, which includes Triceratops frill. In other words, chewed up bits of Triceratops. So we know that T. rex was a ravenous killer millions of years before humans appeared on the scene. But in Genesis 3:14 to 20, we read that the fall of creation, including all this death and predation and suffering, is somehow the result of the sins of Adam and Eve. So I'll make this simple for you. Just explain to me how Adam and Eve can possibly be held responsible for T. rex. I don't need to hear about the Hubble deep field. Just explain that scary meat eating reptilian predator. How did two human beings eating a piece of forbidden fruit in a garden turn T. rex into a fearsome Jurassic Park exhibition? This is sort of the question distilled down to its essence. How do you make sense of this kind of claim? The sad thing is, as I saw on Twitter, So many Christians haven't even given this a moment's consideration. Look, we should have a faith-seeking understanding. We should love God with all our minds. We should be thinking about and asking difficult questions like this. Because if you desire to have truth, as Christians purportedly profess to do that, then you should be willing to ask the hard questions of your own beliefs. Okay, so then I say, well, let's start. This is me talking back to Mia. Let's start with one specific attempt to take the bull by the horns. William Dembski approached the problem like this, and I quote Dembski. He says, to make us realize the full extent of human sin, God does not merely allow personal evils, i.e., the disordering of souls and the sins we commit as a result, to run their course subsequent to the fall. In addition, God allows natural evils, death, predation, parasitism, disease, drought, floods, famines, earthquakes, and hurricanes to run their course prior to the fall. Thus, God Himself wills the disordering of creation, making it defective on purpose. Okay, the one thing to appreciate here is the standard young earth creationist claim is that, well, there was no death on planet Earth until Adam and Eve fell, and then Tyrannosaurus Rex, who would have been living contemporaneously or after, I guess, could have lived after Adam and Eve, suddenly well, if it was living contemporaneous to Adam and Eve, it was a herbivore, and then became a carnivore because of what Adam and Eve did. And a great white shark swimming in the ocean was like, doo doo doo, I'm peaceful and gentle, like Finding Nemo, and then suddenly they were changed into become the great white shark of Jaws infamy because of what Adam and Eve did. And you could go on down the line, jaguars and cheetahs were peaceful cats, gentle kittens just chewing their cud in the fields of grass alongside the cows until Adam and Eve sinned, and then they changed and they become these fearsome predators on the savannah and in the jungle. And that's the picture of the young Earth creationist. Now, Dembski, as an old Earth creationist, an intelligent design theorist, knows that young Earth creationism is not defensible scientifically, so he adopts this new theory. And according to his new theory, Adam and Eve fell, but when they fell, there was already epochs, eons of death, suffering, predation, carnivory, etc., in creation. But God willed that suffering and disorder and death from the beginning on purpose, as he says. Okay, now back to the text. So then Mia responds and says, wait, what? Let me get this straight. You're saying that God made T Rex a predator on purpose? Why? What is the causal mechanism that would explain this? How is it that the actions of two people in a garden could ever cause events millions of years before those human beings even existed? It doesn't make any sense. So then Randall, me, I respond, yeah, well, according to Dembski, God creates foreknowing how human beings will act, and he builds a response to their future sinful actions into creation from the beginning. And so, even though T Rex came first, it was created from the beginning as a predator in response to God's foreknowledge of the future actions of Adam and Eve. Now, Dembski also says and argues in his work that God does this, at least in part, because then the sin and the death and suffering of T Rex will reflect to Adam and Eve and to all human beings the gravity of sin. So then Mia says, huh? I must admit that I don't even understand what you're saying. The point of T Rex the Predator is somehow to get human beings to figure out that we're sinful? Is this not like the most ineffective and gratuitous way to communicate a message in the history of the universe? How is it justified to make a T Rex that will eat a Triceratops 70 million years ago so that we can discover a bit of its fossilized dung today and thereby be led to contemplate our own sinfulness? So, to sum up, I think Mia's points here are excellent. I think Dembski's very contrived ad hoc attempt to explain away the fossil record is just painful, to be honest. I don't think it works at all. I think that the best way forward for something like this is to recognize, well, first of all, that the Genesis creation narrative, creation is described in Genesis 1 as being good and very good, not perfect. The Hebrew does not talk about perfection, but goodness. And Irenaeus in the second century had this, what we would today maybe call a sort of evolutionary developmental understanding of creation, understanding that creation and human beings in creation were created good, but not perfect, and thus with the ability to develop and further mature. And with that view, you can say, so creation was created good, but there's still a lot of suffering in it from the beginning. And we're moving in a trajectory of history into the eschaton in the future toward a time where there will be no longer suffering, but every tear will be wiped away from the eye of every resurrected sentient creature. But we're not there now. Very briefly, I would think you need to go to an Irenaean approach and a theodicy of Irenaeus rather than an Augustinian approach, which would really emphasize perfection in the beginning, and thus the kind of views that young earth creationists assume. This is one way to begin to dig out of the impossible position of either endorsing young earth creationism, where Adam and Eve contemporaneously changed Tyrannosaurus rex into becoming a fearsome predator, or where God created Tyrannosaurus rex 70 million years ago as a fearsome predator because God was responding to the future foreknown actions of Adam and Eve. Neither one of those, to my mind, is a very plausible view. To wrap up, the real thing I think here for Christians and conservative evangelicals, most specifically, who are often the most uninformed and vociferous on these issues and reactionary, as I found out yesterday on Twitter, is develops some intellectual curiosity to explore your beliefs, again, to explore the problems with those beliefs and seek new, deeper understandings of them. And a good way to do that would be to pick up a copy of Conversations with My Inner Atheist, which I've linked below.